Hello guys, Colonel Ninny here.
If you are considering upgrading from a mouse, keyboard or head tracking system to VR, then this video is for you. In it, we're going to ask 6 basic questions. And what better way to get those answers for you than to get them from expert players like those on our OPFR squadron. What this video will not do is tell you which is the best VR headset to purchase. And the reason for that is there are so many other considerations besides the headset itself that you need to consider before purchasing any system. So we'll have a brief chat about transitioning to VR and then hand it over to the experts. In the description below, I'll put a timestamp for each question so you can listen at length to each of their responses. There's no doubt that transitioning to VR will give you an incredible experience. But what are the costs, what is involved, and is it really worth it in the long run? If you're like most players, you started out using a mouse to look around the screen, maybe transition to the top hat on your joystick. And so the best transition from that is to go to a head tracking system like TrackIR. And as you gain more experience, you obviously will want to have more engine control and management of your aircraft. And this means you're going to need a lot of key binding. Not to worry, I've covered that in a couple of other videos. So let me be very clear here. I personally do not have VR. I use a head tracking system. Do I want VR? Well, of course I do. I just don't want to go about getting a second mortgage in order to make that happen. So with no further ado, let's ask these experts the 6 questions here, starting with number 1. How does VR improve your flying experience? Ginger?
The main benefit of VR is the immersion factor. I had played some flight sims when I was a kid on a monitor, but later in life, when I'd flown some real airplanes, I could never really get into that monitor experience because when you look around naturally in an airplane, you could see wherever you're looking. And it wasn't until some number of years later when I saw a video of a guy using VR where he's naturally moving his head and the view naturally moves with you that I kind of got interested in it and tried it out.
Rooster?
The best thing about VR compared to head tracking or using the other system is the depth perception you get from being in a 3D world. You can tell distance, at least from like a target when you're trying to fire, or buildings and ground stuff when you're flying low and trying to go between trees. The VR definitely helps with that, and that's where it really shines, is just being able to get really close to things and not being worried about how close you are to them. You really get that sense of distance in VR compared to a tracking and head tracking system.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was immediately blown away at what it does. I had no concept of what VR was capable of prior to trying it myself. The number one thing that I didn't understand before I put on a headset the first time is that it's natively 3D. Because your computer renders a different image for each of your eyeballs, you get stereoscopic vision that your brain stitches together. So when you spawn into the cockpit of a Spitfire, it feels like you're in the cockpit of a Spitfire. You have depth perception to all the elements around you. You know, you can look around, you can lean your head out of the cockpit. You know, you can do all kinds of stuff like you would in real life, even though you're sitting in a chair in front of your computer.
And Cuban?
In VR, I'm in the cockpit and nothing else has compared to it as far as a flight sim. TrackIR has some benefits over VR. Just the feeling of sitting, in a Spitfire or a Typhoon or a P-38 and having that sense of scale, that's irreplaceable to me.
Dome, your thoughts?
So I probably don't have a whole lot of experience in IL-2 on a monitor, purely because I picked this up at the start of the year. So I've only ever flown IL-2 Great Battles in VR. While I definitely have experience in flight sims previous to this on a monitor, but what it does improve is, since depth perception is so much better, since you have exactly how your eyes would work in real life, judging distances, Going for deflection shots become far, far more simple. Just because your brain interprets that way in reality, and it just applies straight there. So your gunnery skills would definitely improve.
And how about you, Baz?
I still remember the first time I jumped into VR in the cockpit of a 109. It was like going from playing a game on a monitor to actually being in the war. It was, I remember it very well. It was amazing. And being able to look around, and not just look around, but actually move your head in a three-dimensional space around the cockpit. You know, you can press your head up against the window and get a much better view. You know, I'd used track IR before VR, and the differences, I mean, there's no comparison. It's amazing. I can't compare VR with track IR or VR with a monitor. I mean, it's just a completely different experience. And you know, even getting shot down is just a real thrill, because you know you just you're in the world. It's like, it feels like it's really happening, except for the G-forces and all that. You know, it's just amazing.
And what would be your first consideration before deciding to buy a headset?
The first thing I would consider when buying a VR headset, it would be the system that you have to run the VR headset is adequate enough to use it. Like in a game like IL-2 or even like DCSI, the system I have, I consider on the lower scale of having a good experience, and that would be I have a 10th gen i5 processor. It's got its 10 core processor, and also I have a GTX 1660 Ti, which is comparable to a 1070. That would be I would say it wouldn't be the minimum to play it, but the minimum to have a good solid experience and actually enjoy it. And if you have anything less, you'll probably have to drop the setting and sit down. So far, it's not really enjoyable, and that's what the main thing I would definitely recommend looking at before getting into VR.
And Ginger?
The VR experience can be a bit of a money pit. So if you are an extremely budget conscious gamer and you don't necessarily have some money to throw at it, VR might not be the right choice for a number of reasons. For starters, the VR headsets themselves can be relatively expensive. I mean, there's a bunch out there. Some are better than others, and obviously there's new ones coming around all the time. But you know, you can spend upwards of $1,000 on a VR headset, if not more, even in 2021. So that the headset itself is a fairly good expense. On top of that, you need to have a pretty fast computer with a pretty good GPU to run VR well. The easiest way to think about it is, because the VR experience is rendering two different images, like we said, you can basically think of it right off the bat as whatever your computational load was to run the game, you basically have to double it to run VR. Because now, instead of just rendering the single image for your monitor, you have to render two images, one for your left eye, one for your right eye for displaying the headset. So it's a pretty, you know, incredible leap in terms of the processing power that you need to push it. As a result, you know, a lot of people end up turning settings down and whatnot, and depending on how ridiculous a computer you have and how high a resolution VR headset you have, it's all going to vary. But across the board, it takes a lot more horsepower to run VR than it does non-VR gaming.
And what's the Scottish perspective, Dom?
My main considerations before buying a VR headset would be exactly what I want to do with it. Now, if I am thinking to myself, I am only going to be using it for simulations, whether it be flying, racing simulation, that style of cockpit simulation, then that would influence my choice of headset. But if I'm thinking to myself, well, I would actually like to try the other styles of VR games that are available, then that would also affect the choice of headset. Because at the moment, with where we are with headsets, there's definitely no clear one that does everything amazing. Some are better at others for different aspects of that. So those two considerations, as in what I'm going to do with this headset, what is my main goal, and then that would really set what headset I would select.
And Cuban, do you agree?
My first consideration would be visual quality overall. So compare, the field of view, the resolution that you get in each headset, and a website that I use to sort of compare different headsets in my price range is vr-compare.com. you can easily select multiple headsets and just have a comparison table of all their specs, the resolution per eye. It even shows what kind of display they're using and what kind of lens.
And your turn, Baz.
First of all, you want to get a headset that your PC can run smoothly. VR takes more resources, even though you're running a lower resolution. You're running it between two eyes. You're turning two different renders, so it takes more resources than if you were playing it on your monitor. So one thing is, make sure you're choosing a headset that your PC can run, or if you can upgrade your PC. Of course, you won't really know until you get there, but that's something to keep in mind. Overall resolution is important. It helps greatly, but having said that, even if you go at a lower resolution headset, it's still a completely different experience. It's still amazing.
And Cuban has more to add.
Yeah, I would focus on having possibly the best combination of resolution and field of view, especially in whatever headset you choose for whatever price range you have. So with my first headset, the Oculus CD1, the resolution was quite poor, and the sense of immersion was great, and I quite enjoyed being in dogfights and needing to look around like you would in real life. But I had a problem with friendly fire because of that, so I would definitely recommend, if you can afford something better than the first generation Oculus, please do.
And what problems have you had with your systems?
One needs to temper expectations getting in VR initially. If you think that you're going to put a headset on and it's going to look as crisp as a nice 1080p or 4K monitor, you're going to be disappointed.
And Rooster's perspective?
The main frustration I've had with my headset, which is a Quest 2, would be this is kind of a dual setup for a VR where you can do it standalone, and it has a link system that you hook directly up to the computer. That link system can disconnect very easily. It's really, really finicky, and you literally, with mine, I've had it literally tied to my headset, and it still will have random disconnects, which can be very frustrating, especially when you're in a fight or going off to a target and have been flying for 2 hours or so and then getting disconnected. It's really frustrating. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough where it is an irritating situation. Also, at least for the Quest 2, the battery life is okay, but when you have family or like with kids and they use it and then they don't plug it in, or you go to play it and it's got no battery life left, you're not going to be playing VR for a while. So that's another limitation to at least the setup I have with Quest 2. I can't speak to the other VR headsets, but that's the limitation that the Quest 2 has.
The experience overall is much better for some of those, that 3D feeling and the depth perception and whatnot. However, the fact is the graphics in the headset are not as good as they are on a monitor. The way I always kind of explain this to people is you see these headsets, even like the first generation Oculus Rift, I think they advertised it as like a 1080p headset. That's great, but that's talking about a number of pixels, and it's really kind of meaningless in the grand scheme of things, because the way to think about it is if you have a 1080p television and it's sitting across the room from you, it's only taking up a very small portion of your field of view. And if you walked up close enough to that television such that you couldn't see anything else except for the television, you would obviously be able to see individual pixels and whatnot, and that's kind of how those initial headsets were. Now, we're a couple generations beyond that now. Again, I'm currently playing on a Reverb G2, which is a significantly higher resolution than that original Rift, such that you can't, you can still make out the pixels if you really focus on them, but again, it's not going to be as crisp as a monitor would be.
So for my second headset, my big frustration with that is it uses a USB-C connection. I've got the Quest 2, which is insanely better as far as visual quality from the CD1. You almost have 4K per eye resolution, and it's great. You can ID a lot easier. But the connector, because it's USB-C, it doesn't. It's not a solid connection as some other headsets. You have to take steps to make sure that that cable stays secure if you're using PC Link. Otherwise, you will get disconnected from the game. and that's just a terrible thing for anybody that's trying to be competitive in this game.
VR in particular, all headsets vary, and they're really people dependent because shape of head, distance between your eyes, all these things have a factor. So some people will tell you that one headset is perfect and this is what you want to use, while other people might tell you, this headset is the one to choose. Now for the G2, in my experience, I do find it comfortable, but it's a little tight in my face because I've got a rather large head. And I also find the lenses, while excellent, the sweet spot, i.e. the clearest part of the lens, is smaller than the previous headset I used, which was the Rift S. But to counter all that, the resolution in the G2 is really, really good. Therefore, in a game like IL-2, it makes everything a lot better. Spotting in particular, even ID in aircraft, is a lot better than my previous headset.
I've had a couple of issues with my particular setup. I've had some tracking issues. I had a tracking tower die several times. It's not specific to flight sims or IL-2, but of course, if you have an outside tracking system, and you lose a tracking, one of your towers goes out, then it kind of cuts down on your ability to move your head around. You want to get that replaced quickly. I mean, one thing you got to keep in mind is that you have a headset on your face, so you can't see the room around you, and you cannot see your keyboard, you cannot see your mouse. So you got to keep in mind that if you're using a keyboard, you can't really move your hand, or it's pretty easy to lose it in the dark.
I'd say limitations or some issues I've had with the headsets. There are some hardware issues that come about with it. I've had a few hardware problems here and there. Sometimes the connecting cords can be a little bit fragile. I know a lot of people are playing with that the Oculus Quest 2 with the link cable right now. The problem with that is it's a USB plug-in cable. There's no latch on it, so if it pulls out while you're moving your head around looking for a bandit, then well, you just lost your connection. The game's gonna drop you. So there's problems like that. It's all relatively easy to work around if you put a little bit of time on it, and I'd say most of the major problems people have come up with solutions for. I don't have any huge issues. I did have some cable issues with the Reverb G2 initially, but it turned out I was just bending it too tightly, and that cable doesn't really like that. So as long as you treat it with kid gloves to an extent, then you'll be fine. But generally speaking, overall, I want to be very clear that the experience of VR massively outweighs, in my opinion, any of these limitations or hardware problems that I've had. I just can't even imagine having any interest in playing these games without it. So any kind of bumps in the road that you experience with it are pretty minor, in my opinion. But there are other people out there who have tried it and it wasn't for them. So it kind of depends on who you're talking to. But I think overall, most of the people I'm aware of who play with VR can't imagine going back to any other way.
And what about your equipment's reliability?
There's no problem with my screen or any kind of like weird artifacts or anything of that aspect. And the tracking in the headset is very good, and that never had any issues with that. No, just random shut-offs or anything like that. I would say it's reliable, really reliable.
My first headset was the original Oculus CV1, and besides the fact that it's fairly narrow field of view and pretty low resolution, that was my first VR experience in IL-2, and I still remember it. It was amazing. I've since upgraded to the Valve Index. It's sharper. The tracking's about the same. The Oculus tracking was very good, and the field of view is much wider. And the only issues I've had is 3 times I think I've had to replace one of my tracking stations, the lighthouses. But since I mounted them to the wall, it doesn't have that ability to fall over. So since I've done that, I've had no issues with it whatsoever. Tracking is almost perfect, except for if I look down and to the left, like if I'm looking behind my left wing, I've got kind of a dead zone there where sometimes I'll lose tracking. So I'll just have to move my head a little bit and it'll pick back up. But other than that, VR-wise, I've had almost no issues. I love my headset, and except for the price, I would recommend it as a current setup.
Okay, I think in this category, I've had a rather good experience with the G2. I've really had no problems with it whatsoever. But I went into it knowing that there was cable issues, USB issues that some people have, a few things. But since I've had 3 headsets before this, the G2, I knew that my setup would be pretty good for it, and I've been extremely careful with the cable, so I'm still on the original cable, which I know a lot of people aren't. But so the G2's been 100% reliable. I've had 0 issues with it at all.
I noticed a really weird issue, the Oculus CD1. It was drawing too much power from the external sensors that it uses to track your head. With that generation headset and some of the other headsets that are still around, you have external sensors that measure where your head is. Those sensors take quite a lot of power in some cases, and a strange thing that was happening with my particular setup, I have not heard this being a widespread issue, but I was getting ghost button pushes. So all of a sudden my landing gear would come down in the middle of a dogfight. And that was pretty terrible. So I had to actually unmap a lot of stuff from my joystick and throttle. When I moved to the Quest 2, and that has onboard tracking, it uses cameras on the headset to track your movement, so you don't need to have external sensors. I got rid of that necessity, and once I unplugged those sensors, the ghost button pushes stopped completely. So I figured out that's what was causing them. So one thing I did to solve that problem is I 3D printed some clips that hold the cable in place to the side of the headset. And then I also make sure that I have a little bit of slack over my head so that if it does get pulled, it won't pull the connector right away.
And now the biggest and probably most expensive question is, what advice do you have about peripherals like throttles and joysticks?
When I switched from I had a D-Land clip before I went to a Quest 2, and I had a very basic, like old school Microsoft Sidewinder joystick, and it worked fine. But once I switched to VR, it became apparent very quickly, without being able to see the keyboard, which I use a lot because of the lack of buttons on that joystick. I had to get a better joystick and eventually a throttle, because you need to have pretty much everything bound to the joystick and throttle that you can feel very quickly, because you're not going to be able to see anything in the headset. You can try to look under it, but it's just very difficult. And what I did, I ended up getting a new BKB stick, and I found a really good price. Use TWCS Thrustmaster throttle with a ton of buttons, and that is what I recommend. And I did it relatively cheaply. I had to do a lot of searching and on the used market and stuff. But it's highly recommended to get a good joystick and throttle and the rudder pedals if you can, with a lot of buttons, because you're going to need to bind a lot of things to them.
For this category, for peripherals, I would say the more you have, the easier it is. The key for me, I would say, is if you can get rid of using the keyboard at all, you will have a far better experience. A throttle with a decent amount of buttons, a button box will help. A set of axes will really help. But if you find yourself reaching for that keyboard in VR, I think you'll just never quite get used to that. You'll always be fumbling about for keys. So the more buttons you have that are not on a keyboard, and you know the location of them, it makes it far better experience.
Generally, when you're flying IL-2 and a VR headset on, because you can't, if you have your throttle on your joystick, you cannot switch between your joystick and your keyboard because you can't see your keyboard. It's much better to have all of those buttons available on both your hands, so you've got a separate control in each hand, aka hands-on throttle setup. So you've got your throttle and your joystick.
The other sort of wormhole that myself and pretty much everyone I know who plays with VR has found themselves going down is the peripherals. So your joystick, your throttle, rudder pedals, all that kind of stuff. Because you're playing in a headset, you can't see your keyboard. So if you've traditionally played with a joystick and maybe you got a few buttons on there, but you do 75% of your commands for the flight sims on your keyboard, in VR, that's almost impossible. I mean, it can be done, but it's very, very difficult. And what myself and, like I said, pretty much everyone I know who gets into VR eventually finds themselves doing is buying kind of fancy HOTAS systems where you've got a ton of buttons. And as it is, I've gone down several different versions of things, but now I've got a ridiculous Virpil setup with a billion buttons on it where I can have everything mapped and I don't have to worry about the keyboard at all. Now, that's not to say that you have to do that, but it is, fair warning that you do find yourself needing those peripherals. So it really, unfortunately, comes down to being a bit of a money issue between the headset, the computer, and the peripherals. The tendency is to find that you're always wanting to upgrade those to get a better experience, and that just means how much cash you're willing to throw at the problem.
You definitely need a good HOTAS setup, I think. Personally, I've got the X55. You've got a lot of inputs on both the joystick and the throttle. And just make sure you can map whatever you need in the sim that's critical. Joystick and throttle, sorry. I still use the keyboard for some things, but it's usually things that are not as mission critical. I would also suggest that before getting VR, invest in having a set of rudder pedals as well. Because outside of VR, I found them very helpful. And in VR, I can't imagine flying without actual rudder.
Do you think it makes you a better pilot?
I would say it definitely does. Like I said, I haven't played great battles on a monitor, but with previous flight sims using them on flat screen, as well as VR, I would say that it definitely does. Just because everything feels real, size of everything, position of everything. So you judge those things like you naturally would in the real world. While on a monitor, you can definitely get extremely good at judging these things, but it doesn't come that naturally. You need hours and hours before you develop those skills. While in VR, that feels pretty immediate on how it should.
So I do think that it does make you a better pilot in that you'll have a, depth perception is a big thing. And I think it has helped my gunnery. I think it has helped my landings greatly. And you get a much better sensation of speed at low altitude when you're in VR, and it feels like you're in the cockpit. You might have some competitive disadvantages from, say, track IR, because in track IR it's much easier to look behind you, and let's face it, a lot of monitors still have better resolution than VR, so you might be able to spot an ID at longer ranges. But I think that if you get used to looking behind you, you can still have much better situational awareness near you in VR.
Not in and of itself. I think it can probably increase your ceiling a little bit, but the fact is there's nothing about VR that makes you fly smarter. There's nothing about VR that inherently gives you better situational awareness. And you still need to be looking around to figure out what's happening.
Having VR absolutely does not make you a better pilot. If anything, I think as far as a competition standpoint, I think I might actually decrease slightly going to VR, because one of the main things that you go to is not being able to check your 6 as easily in VR. You literally have to strain your neck back just like you were in the plane and like it was in real life. And then with head tracking, you can just dart your head around and see all over the place in just microscopic seconds. They do have add-on things to VR that make that quicker as far as checking your 6. But it still, to me, kills the immersion, which is the biggest benefit of the VR headsets. It's just the immersion and making you feel like you're in the game, and any kind of cheat that helps you with that, I feel just takes away from that aspect. The visibility and tracking or spotting on a 2D monitor is easier because the quality of the image is better, and it's not as good as in the in VR unless you have a really good, really high power system where you can really utilize that aspect of it. But yeah, it does not make you better. There's nothing that makes you that would make you a better pilot compared to somebody using head tracking.
I believe having the VR headset does make me a better pilot. Situational awareness is much higher. If you start with just looking around with a hat switch or something, or a mouse or something like that, while it can be easy to track a plane that you're in a fight with, it's not easy to take your eye off that plane to look at other areas around you and then look back at that plane. It's okay to track that plane constantly, but you lose awareness of everything else that might be going on around you. With both track IR and VR, you can snap your head around quickly, and you can maintain, not just tracking that one target, but keeping an eye on your wingman or whatever else is going on around you. That's just as important. You're not just rotating your head around, but you're actually, you're moving your head in a three-dimensional space inside your cockpit, just like if you were in the cockpit. So I can lean over and press my head up against the window and look down, and if some of the controls in some of the planes you can't even see unless you like crane your head, like the little clown plane. the name of it escapes me. You have to look under the dash to actually see what your speed and all that is. So it comes in really handy in situations like that.
That's the I-16, right?
Yes, the I-16. Yep.
I do think there's some limited things where, compared to a monitor, if you could measure it, you might find a slightly increased performance. One of those, in my opinion, I have no data to back this up, would be gunnery. Again, because you actually have that depth perception relative to your target, I think it would be easier to hit it in VR relative to a monitor. Now, that being said, I haven't played on a monitor in forever, so I can't even compare it for my own stats. But I have heard other people who've switched over said, oh man, I feel like I can much more easily pull a lead shot on a guy and figure out where the bullets are going to meet him downrange. But other than that, it's a tool, and I'd say, it certainly increases my enjoyment of the game. It makes it more fun because you feel like you're in it. But in terms of increasing your performance, no, I think that really comes down to a much different set of factors than anything that VR addresses.
Well, thank you everyone for your insight and input and the time you put into help me put this video together. And there's a bonus topic about Steam VR from Ginger.
There's a number of different VR ecosystems that are currently available on a Windows computer. Steam essentially has its own VR system. If you're running, there's essentially a couple different families of headsets. I've had some Windows mixed reality headsets. I've also had some Oculus headsets. I have not had a Pimax. I did have an Index, which was a Steam VR headset. But it's essentially, we're just talking about different software and what can run what. Now, the problem that comes about is some of the software runs more smoothly than others. So that Steam software is known for being a little bit clunky and decreasing performance. However, it's sort of the most universally used one. There's a software workaround. If you're using a Oculus headset, it's possible to install this other piece of software, which if I'm remembering correctly, I think it's called Open Composite, although it's changed names a few times over the years. It's basically a mod that lets the Oculus headset sidestep Steam VR and hence get you a performance boost. So most of the times you hear people talking about this, it's all in the names of performance, and really that kind of comes back to what we were talking about initially, being that VR is just a monster when it comes to GPU and CPU requirements. So you're always going to hear people talking about doing all kinds of ridiculous things to wring whatever little bit of performance their hardware they possibly can in the name of getting a reasonable frame rate, which is important in VR because if you don't have a good frame rate in your headset, that can essentially make you motion sick. Your brain will get very, very upset that it feels your head moving around and that the image is not tracking at a reasonable rate as it does that. That will manifest itself as the same kind of motion sickness that you can feel in a car, and can obviously throw people off. So people are always trying to increase that frame rate to prevent those sorts of issues.
Well guys, thanks for watching. I hope you've learned as much as I have about VR. See you next time. Okay, Ninny's coming around to drop 3 more.
As always, if you've enjoyed this video, found it helpful, like it or subscribe, or if there's another topic you'd like me to cover, please leave a comment.